Hello, I'm Al Benzing, and I'm here to introduce the second of our B-24 checkout webinars. We had Kathy Royer as a co-pilot checkout just this week, and now we're introducing Curt Lewis, who did his pilot, or what we call aircraft commander checkout. And I was the instructor for both of these in 2019. And I think you'll find this to be another interesting webinar. It's a bit more in depth as you go for aircraft commander. And both Curt and Kathy did a very nice job in their respective checkouts. We'll get into the webinar itself very shortly. I did want to mention that the reason that we're providing these, or one of the reasons, as well as the education aspect of it, is we are doing fundraising so that we can keep these aircraft flying. And September and October, we're going to focus on the B-24, not only because we need operating funds, but because this aircraft has a specific need for some parts for her landing gear, which are going to cost us $50,000. So along with our other fundraising efforts, we have been offering the Books for Bombers, which is on our website, our CAF b29b24.org. And with this webinar this week, we're offering an additional book. This is called Before the Bell. This is a very intriguing story about a B-24 called Hot Stuff and its crew, who had completed 31 missions before the Memphis Belle had completed 25. And she was destined to come home and do a bond tour, as the Memphis Belle eventually did. But there's some tragedy involved here. And we're going to have 2 additional webinars on this subject, on Hot Stuff, her story, and those will be run in October, the first and second week of October. So if you'll look for those. But we're going to introduce the book now so that you can order it and kind of get a leg up on this and have some idea of what this story is about. I know you'll find it a fascinating book. We continue to offer also for the B-24 Ted's Traveling Circus, and for a donation of $124 you could order either of these books. And we continue to offer the Reign of Fire, which is the B-29 centric book by a B-29 aircraft commander, Charles Phillips, another fabulous book. So for $129, that book is available. So with that, I'm going to introduce Curt Lewis and his discussion of his checkout in our B-24 Diamond Lil. Thank you very much for your attention and support.
Hello, I'm Curt Lewis, one of the Commemorative Air Force's volunteer pilots, here to talk about what it's like to fly a B-24 and what it takes to get involved with our squadron in operating these pieces of history. For starters, CAF b29b24.org has information about joining, membership, our aircraft, and our tour schedule. It's where our members can go to access a huge library of members-only documents to study, reference, and become familiar with our airplanes in operation. As I said, my name's Curt Lewis. I've been lucky to be involved with this great group of people since about 2013. I've been flying the B-24 off and on that whole time. Last year I completed my piloting command, or captain aircraft commander check ride, and became qualified as the world's newest B-24 pilot. I've also been lucky to fly our B-29 Fifi as a co-pilot since about 2018, and am qualified in our trainer fleet, which consists of a Stearman T6 and a T-34. I fly for a major airline that pays the bills and gives me the flexible work schedule that lets me spend a good deal of my time out on the road sharing these airplanes with the public. I also have a background in gliders, Part 135, charter and cargo flying, as well as flight instruction. Pretty common question we get is, how do I get involved? I think our current Chief Operating Officer, David Oliver, says it best with just show up. You just got to show up, right? One Last week, Kathy Royer talked about kind of the more formal process of joining, but for someone interested in participating in an active way as a volunteer or better yet, a crew member, the best way to become part of what we do is just to show up and shake some hands or bump elbows in this day and age at one of our many member events that we host. Everyone's very friendly and willing to talk old airplanes and history with a perfect stranger while helping you get connected with the right people in the squadron to become more involved in whichever area you're interested in. I'm going to end this slide with another quote from David Oliver and say that we come for the airplanes, but we stay for the people. So when you show up and you continue to show up, you're bound to make some great lifelong friends and be presented with amazing opportunities involving these airplanes that many people can only dream about. To branch off from that, I'll share my story of how I got involved. It might be pretty obvious I'm still on the younger side of the average modern day warbird pilot. Even though at 29 right now, I'd have been the old man back in the 1940s. But I'm blessed to have the best parents that anybody could ask for, and to say that they've been supportive of my lifelong interest in aviation would be an understatement. My dad's been flying gliders his whole life, and that means I grew up the airport brat, spending time with him every weekend at the glider port, bumming all kinds of airplane rides. We also never missed an air show or a flying breakfast, and at all those events, it was always the warbirds that were the most interesting to me. And every time a Merlin powered airplane or a round engine would go by, I'd think, how do I get to do that? Of course, as I got older, it became pretty obvious that a lot of the crew members on these airplanes were on the grayer side, and I kind of assumed that warbirds would have to wait until I was like a senior airline pilot or maybe even retired someday. But fast forward a bunch of years to 2013, and I was a senior at Southern Illinois University, working as a flight instructor on the side, and a CAF internship program that's still running strong today was launched, mostly for aviation maintenance students. But the B-29 flight operations officer at the time, again, David Oliver, our current COO that I mentioned to his contact at SIU that they would welcome a younger pilot that would meet the minimum qualifications and be a good fit for a B-24 co-pilot. So I'll never forget the phone call I got from that guy, Charlie Rodriguez, that I took in my little instructor office, asking me how I'd like to go fly a B-24. It wasn't quite that easy though, but long story short, joined the squadron in the headquarters. 5 of us carpooled down to ground school in a Prius to Dallas, Texas. And just kind of showed up at a lot of the tour stops, getting to know people, and made myself available so that inevitably, when a hole developed in the schedule, I found myself checked out as a B-24 co-pilot between Duluth, Minnesota, and Fargo. Kind of like how Kathy got a chance at a checkout. I was only 22 years old, and I still know how lucky I am, and how rare those opportunities are. So I did everything I could to stay involved and continue to grow in our group here, including moving to Dallas. And I've been real selective with my employment and only taking positions that would allow me to continue to be involved with our squadron, especially on tour. Anyway, don't like talking about myself a lot, but I can never thank my parents, David Oliver and Charlie Rodriguez, enough for jump-starting my warbird career a few decades there. So Kathy talked about minimum requirements to check out as a co-pilot of the B-24, but here's that slide again. I just want to add that piloting commands only require 1,000 total time, 500 multi-engine PIC, and 25 in type. That's not very much. Our average aircraft commanders have quite a bit more than that, but that's the insurance minimum. And maybe if you're 1,000 hours in a DC-3 or a B-25, we might be able to work with you, but we require quite a bit of experience before upgrading normally. On our pilot selection team, which is called the Flight Evaluation Board, just like in the military, is selecting pilot crew members. We're looking for someone with a wide range of experience. We need people that, anyone that's selected as a co-pilot to fly one of the bombers is someone who we ideally can picture upgrading to aircraft commander eventually. Unfortunately, training in these airplanes is expensive. We don't have any simulators like the airlines do, so it makes selecting the right pilots difficult. The Flight Evaluation Board selects crews based on attitude, aptitude, and availability. Attitude and availability are pretty self-explanatory, but aptitude Means we're looking for someone that's got good VFR stick and rudder skills combined with experience in multi-engine flying in a crewed airplane, like you would find in military airlines or corporate. Since we do operate in a similar way to like a small airline or a Part 135 operation, and we require the same high standards of airmanship and professionalism that you'd find in a company like that. Tailwheel experience is desirable for two reasons. Obviously, our bombers aren't tailwheel airplanes, but they do have a lot in common with them. For example, like our average takeoff in one of the bombers might require full rudder input, sometimes even both directions on a normal day. They're pretty directionally unstable and unforgiving. So that kind of correlates to a tailwheel airplane. Also, if you have tailwheel experience, that means we could probably have you flying our Stearman and T6 on tour. It's not super rare where I'll do 2 bomber rides in the morning and then carry my stuff over to Stearman and fly that until sunset on my plane. So cross training is good. I mentioned how we operate with the same professionalism as an airline, and one way that that's shown is our amazing library of manuals, checklists, and documents that are available in our squadron members-only Dropbox as soon as you join. They're very detailed, and we update them regularly as we identify and develop new information or a better way of doing things. So it makes studying for an initial or recurrent qualification event with the most up-to-date information very easy and productive. Our B-24 doesn't fly with fewer than 4 people on board. We got a pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and scanner. The pilot and co-pilot roles are pretty self-explanatory, but the flight engineer on these airplanes is the first one to arrive at the airplane and the last one to leave. So they're responsible for general kind of day-to-day maintenance, the pre-flight inspections, fueling, weight and balance for each flight, and the general day-to-day caretakers of the airplane. During taxi, you'll see them in that lower left picture, kind of perched out of the cockpit hatch to ensure wingtip clearances. The pilot's in the cockpit because the engine's on either side. We can't see the wingtip, so the flight engineer out the top can see the wingtip and make sure that we're not going to hit anything. This is a big airplane, 110-foot wingspan. It's about like a 737, and we take it into some pretty small, like 5,000-foot long runways. Airports that don't see a lot of 737-sized airplanes showing up, basically. Our 4th crew member is the scanner. They ride in the back of the airplane and act as an extra set of eyes. So again, the 3 of us in the cockpit, we can't see the back half of the engine. So we could have a problem with an engine, whether it's producing smoke or fire or something like that, that the only way we would have of knowing about that is the scanner seeing it and identifying it for us. So, or any other problems. Any other problem basically behind the wing, those of us in the cockpit are going to be super aware of. So during ride flights, that scanner is the busiest person we have on the airplane, since we have up to 10 passengers at a time with us. That scanner has to kind of herd them around the tight confines of the airplane to make sure everybody gets a chance to experience each station during our 30-minute flight. My PIC initial check ride, here's a 4-flight track over the DFW sectional of what it looked like, and on the right side is a kind of just a list of all the maneuvers I had to demonstrate for that. So you can see we did it based out of the airplane's home base at Fort Worth Meacham, and did a few approaches and landings up there at Fort Worth Alliance Airport just next door. And with that, we're going to get into talking a little bit more about some of those required tasks on there. Starting with the engine start. Starting a radial engine is an art form, and doing it 4 times for each flight can either be a masterpiece or an embarrassment. It requires cooperation between the 2 pilots and a total of about 3 hands. So you'll see in those pictures there that the pilot doing the start will have one hand on the appropriate throttle, and the other hand on the overhead panel manipulating the starter and primer switches. So the pilot not doing the active starting of the airplane is standing by ready to turn the magnetos. Those red switches are basically the ignition on, and then advance the mixture knob when the pilot doing the start calls for it. You'll notice we always start in the order of 3, 4, 2, 1. That's mostly to check the hydraulic pump on engine number 3. So we start that one first and make sure that that one's producing hydraulic pressure on its own. You'll also notice that we, at shutdown, leave engine number 2 running for a couple extra seconds, and then we're again just verifying that the hydraulic pump on that engine can run the hydraulic systems on its own as well. So we check both of our engine-driven hydraulic systems on every flight. Taxiing. You can really tell how experienced someone is in the B-24 by how well they taxi the airplane. I think pretty much every B-24 pilot will agree that it's the most difficult phase of flight to learn and become proficient at. That's mostly because there's no nose wheel steering, right? The nose wheel is just like a cast screen shopping cart wheel with nothing connected to it. So that means directional control is accomplished with differential throttle and differential braking using these old 1940s style expander tube brakes. So the technique to be successful at using the brakes is holding a little bit of pressure on the brake pedal to keep the tube slightly inflated so that when braking is needed, it's immediately available. Kind of like what Kathy was saying, if you just stomp on a brake, nothing happens for a couple seconds while that tube inflates, but then it grabs, and now you have way too much brake and the thing goes darting off towards the grass on the taxiway, and then you stomp on the other brake and it goes darting back the other way. So the trick is to ride the brake pedals without actually riding the brakes. So we're kind of standing on the brakes to keep that tube inflated, but then when we need brake action, we just only have to move the pedal a tiny bit to inflate the tube just a little bit more to get just a little kiss of brake to keep directional control. It takes a handful of flights, but all of a sudden, once that clicks, then all of a sudden, you look like you know what you're doing when you're taxiing the airplane. So the graphic down there on the bottom left just shows how with a strong wind from the left, instead of making the brakes do all the work, you can add just a little bit of power on the upwind engine to help counter the weather vaning effect during taxi. If you can taxi yourself to the runway, the takeoff is relatively easy. So starting off on the center line with the nose wheel straight is really important and goes a long way towards a nice smooth takeoff. With having the two vertical stabilizers and rudders right behind the number 2 and 3 engines means that rudder control happens pretty fast as we advance power and get air flowing over those surfaces. There are only a few seconds where the only directional control we have is differential engine power, since we don't want to use brakes on takeoff. It's kind of different from our B-29, since the B-29 only has a single rudder or vertical stabilizer, and the engines are offset from that. We have to be going about, sometimes like 70, 80 miles an hour on the B-29 before we can really feel that big rudder doing anything. So takeoffs on the 24 are a little easier than the 29. You can see in that top right graphic, the wing on the ground sits at a slight negative angle of attack. So we really kind of take off in a similar way to how we would take off a tail-wheel airplane. We slightly lift the nose wheel about 80 knots to a slight positive angle of attack, which means you'll have a smooth levitation into the air every time once we get enough speed to break ground. We want to make that's generally at about 100 knots. You have to be careful not to over-rotate, though, and let the airplane become airborne too early, because our VMC speed, or minimum controllable speed, if you guys are familiar with that, is 96 knots. That means with one engine inoperative, below 96 knots, we don't have enough control authority to keep the airplane going straight. So if we have any engine problems below 96 knots, we have to chop power and stop the airplane straight ahead on the runway with an abort, basically. So it's important that we don't become airborne before 96 knots, because then not only would we have to stop, we'd have to land and stop, and we might not have enough runway to do that. Airwork like stalls and steep turns is pretty conventional, but with the added burden of an airplane that doesn't really fly that good. It's a pretty unstable airplane with really heavy controls. That said, we all treasure every minute we get flying the airplane, but it's kind of constant work to keep it in trim and on altitude and heading and everything. A lot of that's the Davis airfoil in the plan form of the wing. It's got this long, skinny wing, which is designed to carry a load and go fast. In the 1940s, handling qualities weren't really at the top of the priority list when they were designing a heavy bomber. They needed it to fly good enough, but they weren't building an airplane to go out and fly well. They wanted to carry as much as they could and go as far and fast as they could. So a lot of that's because again, that skinny wing means it's got a real narrow center of gravity range. What I always think is impressive is something like a Cessna 172 training airplane has a 12-inch center of gravity range, of which the balance point on the airplane could be. But the B-24, being 50,000 pounds heavier only has an 11-inch center of gravity range. So we got a lot of cargo that we can load, and it's very critical we get the airplane loaded correctly to stay within those limits. It also means that anytime someone walks all the way back to the tail gun, we definitely feel it in the cockpit. So on a ride flight, about 10 times, you know, we'll be flying. As soon as someone starts to walk back, we feel a climb coming on, so we correct the climb. Then right about then, the person that was in the back starts to walk forward, and then we get a descent. So on ride flights, we're constantly feeling people going back and forth to that tail gun, which is all in good fun. It's unique to these big 4-engine airplanes that in a steep turn to the left, all the left turning tendencies from 4 left engines produce a noticeable kind of nose down moment. So it takes a lot more back pressure doing a left turn than a right turn. Where in a right turn, those left turning tendencies are acting up and helping to maintain altitude. During a stall recovery, we're not in any hurry ever to advance the power. Just kind of lower the nose and let it pick up speed naturally. When we do advance the power, though, it's nice that we can advance the engines on the left side of the airplane, number 1 and 2, a little bit ahead of the others to kind of counteract the left turning tendencies we're going to get at lower airspeeds when we have less rudder control. Landing a B-24. It's about like any other tricycle gear airplane, but made a little bit more difficult again by those heavy control forces, a low gear extension speed, and the lack of nose wheel steering. So the airplane reacts real slowly to changes in direction and power, so good planning and staying ahead of the airplane is critical to make sure we don't, to make sure we can get a nice stable approach in. I normally land with 30 degrees of flaps, but for practice or shorter runways, we do have 40 degrees of flap available. It's kind of a unique thing with this airplane that the maximum speed with all 40 degrees of flaps extended is 115 knots. As a general practice, we try not to exceed 110 knots with that flap 40 just to provide a buffer. But our approach speed is only 100 knots. So that only gives us about a 10-knot window of being on speed and overspeeding the flaps. If we do end up accidentally overspeeding that 115-knot limit by much, that added air pressure on the flaps actually opens a relief valve in the flaps and they can start retracting, which is not super ideal when you're slow and low to the ground. Or if you go even further than that, you might get a weird kind of burble or disruption of air over the tail, and it'll do this weird little, like a dive or a tuck it's easy to recover from. I'm told. I haven't experienced it, but I'm sure it would get my attention. I think of it a lot like the Cessna 172s that have 40 degrees of flaps that they built in the late 70s that mention avoid slips with the flaps extended. It's kind of for a similar reason, but they don't have to tell us that because it basically means avoid overspeeding the flaps. But we don't have a lot of airspeed to work with when we're landing there. So as I said, we approach 100 knots, but definitely don't exceed 110 for the flaps. Flat 40 landings have way less float time. You know, there's a lot more drag, so the landing happens pretty fast. It requires even more back pressure on the yoke. But, you know, a lot of times when we're flying airplanes, we talk about pressures, but in a B-24 to land, it's not pressures. We're actually moving this yoke like, I don't know, 1.5 feet, 2 feet, it feels like sometimes, you know, way back into our gut. And that you definitely want to eat your Wheaties that morning when you're doing a flat 40 landing, because it takes a lot of back pressure to get the nose up above the horizon for a manual first landing. I kind of tend to think of the B-24 and the B-29 in the pattern like a glider. It reminds me of how I grew up flying gliders. So I set a power setting that'll let us descend and slow down slightly, but then just modify the turn and the geometry of the pattern, and then use flaps as needed to end up in the right spot for landing. We really try to avoid large power applications and reductions just to extend the lives of our expensive engines. Anybody that has ridden with us in the B-24 has probably noticed the flight engineer crawled under the cockpit right before landing. We have 3 green lights in the panel for each of the landing gear to indicate when they're locked down, but there's a secondary latch on the nose wheel that has to be observed visually. So that's another duty of the flight engineers to crawl into the cockpit for every landing and make sure that lock's engaged. Of course, once on the ground, the fun's just begun. Now we're back to the taxi situation again. But even in a crosswind, the rudders are very effective at keeping the airplane straight. But as the airplane slows down and rudder effectiveness diminishes, we have to switch to the brakes for directional control and deceleration. This takes a lot of practice to get good at, so a lot of times we'll use this call out of block the rudders, which means the pilot not flying or doing the landing physically puts his feet on the rudder pedals to keep them from moving, while the pilot doing the landing can get a feel for the brakes and try to get good, smooth, even braking on both wheels. So they can use the brakes for directional control instead of the rudders. Landing with one engine inoperative is really barely noticeable, as long as we staged a little bit high and a little bit fast for most of the pattern, and don't make any big power changes. Landing with only one of the 4 engines inoperative is really a non-event. It's something that co-pilots have to demonstrate on every initial and recurrent check ride. Piloting commands, captains have to do a 3-engine go-around even on their check rides. All that said, the most difficult and demanding thing we do in training with the airplane, only on captain initial and recurrent check rides, is the 2-engine outboard. With 2 engines inoperative on the same wing, the airplane will maintain altitude and is very controllable as long as we maintain airspeed. But the 2-engine landing in the B-24 has an extra level of difficulty because our maximum gear speed is only 135 knots, but our minimum controllable speed with 2 engines out is only 5 knots less than that at 130 knots. So we talked about 96 knots is VMC with 3 engines working, but 130 knots is VMC with only 2 engines working. So on this approach, it's even more critical to stay just a little bit high and a little bit fast to avoid having to use a lot of power on the 2 good engines for directional control reasons. And we try to avoid slowing below 130 knots until we're certain that we are in a good, stable position to land, and the chances of having to do a go-around are minimized. It's not as difficult as it sounds, but it's critical that we do it right, and we always brief the recovery plan and execute that early in the training environment if it looks like we're going to be a little bit slower, a little bit low on approach. As I said, the only time you really do this is in training. The likelihood of having to do it in real life is pretty low, considering you have 4 engines, but demonstrating it well shows a good understanding of the airplane's controllability and performance. As much as I do like talking about this airplane and airplanes in general, it's about all the time I have. I want to remind everyone to check out our website at cafb29b24.org, and especially consider participating in this Books for Bombers and our new Diamond Lil sneakers fundraising campaign. These airplanes have to pay for themselves, and during a productive year of touring, we can generally do that, but 2020 has not been one of those productive years for us for obvious reasons. But in addition to not being able to tour, we're faced with the additional burden of raising $50,000 to replace landing gear parts that were found to be unairworthy during our winter maintenance. So your support in picking up and participating in any or all of these fundraising campaigns will be greatly appreciated and go a long way to making sure we're able to fly this airplane for many years to come. Especially important to get it flying for next spring when Diamond Lil turns 80 years old in May of 2021. So it'd be great if we can celebrate that event in the air. So again, with all that, thanks for joining us. It's been my pleasure putting this together for you guys. I'd love to see everyone at a tour stop soon for a B-24 ride, or even better, at one of our member meetings or annual ground schools to become involved as a crew member yourself. So we welcome everybody with all kinds of skills and talent, as long as you're passionate about these airplanes and the stories they tell. You'll get along just great with everybody. So as much as we all love airplane museums, it's the act of taking these airplanes on the road to share with the public is a whole different experience, and something that I think is very worthwhile to do, and something I'm honored to be a part of. So hope to see everybody out there soon.